Hello. So we are now going to start talking about photosynthesis, and I'm sure you know the basics of photosynthesis, right? We get energy from the sun, and in some way it turns into sugar, which is a food for the plant. We are now going to focus on all of the details that correlate with that process. So in the last video, we talked about energy for life, and we focused on food chains and how that energy flows from one thing to another and to another and to another, and eventually every single organism gets its energy source from some sort of producer. And so now we are going to learn about that process of photosynthesis and how producers produce their food. I'm going to just let you know, full disclosure, this is a pretty complicated and lengthy process. We will spend time in class going over this process in a lot more detail. So you are going to want to leave space in between the steps of photosynthesis. It is not just I capture the sun, turn it into sugar. There is a lot that goes into that process. And so I'm going to briefly describe it here. When we talk about it in class, it'll be a little bit more detailed. And then as we progress throughout the entire unit, we will continue to get more and more detailed. So please be ready. I do highly suggest that you begin studying for the quiz over photosynthesis now rather than later. I don't know when that quiz will be, but you don't want to spend a night before the quiz trying to figure all of this out. It's very stressful. So the things that you should be able to do after this video is you should be able to outline the stages of photosynthesis, describe the chloroplast and its role in photosynthesis, describe the Calvin cycle, and finally define chemosynthesis. So let's just go ahead and start talking about photosynthesis. The first thing that you should know is there are two stages to photosynthesis. And I like this slide because it does a really nice job at summing up the process of photosynthesis in one nice slide. So again, it occurs in two stages. Stage one is known as the light reactions stage, or sometimes you'll hear it called the light reaction stage. Really doesn't matter, but you do need to know that light is involved here. So that means the sun is involved here. And there are other ways to artificially produce light, like if we shine a light on a plant, there are things that could occur. But for this conversation, we are going to be talking about the internal light that is known as the sun. So stage one, light reaction. This uses water and changes light energy from the sun into chemical energy stored in ATP and NADPH. Very quick synopsis of stage one. Another part, oxygen is released as a waste product. So what the plant thinks is a waste product is what we think of as life. So, right, we couldn't live without oxygen. Stage two is all known as the Calvin cycle. It is also referred to as the light independent reaction, or you will hear it called the dark reaction. Those are three names for that stage. And this one combines carbon from carbon dioxide in the air and uses ATP and NADPH to make glucose. So in one stage of photosynthesis, oxygen is our waste product and we are creating ATP and NADPH. In the second stage of photosynthesis, you are now creating glucose from ATP and NADPH. And if you don't know what NADPH is, you shouldn't, because it's a brand new term that we are going to talk about, or brand new molecule that we're going to talk about in this video. All right, so before we can progress on to the conversation of the stages of photosynthesis, we need to talk about where this occurs at. And when we learned about plant cells, we learned about the chloroplast, we learned about chlorophyll. And so we know that photosynthesis takes place in this area somehow. But there are a little more details that I'd like you to know about. So both stages of photosynthesis occur in the chloroplast. And if you can't visualize this, your reading would be a great tool to have. And we will do a visual representation of the chloroplast in class. So don't worry, I will draw this. You know, I'm the best artist in the world. And if my drawing doesn't do justice, I will just probably pull up a picture. So again, both stages of photosynthesis occur in the chloroplast. Where they occur in the chloroplast depends on their reaction, or excuse me, not the reaction, the stage. So each chloroplast, before we can continue there, each chloroplast contains neat stacks called grana. And in the singular version, they're known as granum. So there's these stacks. One stack is known as a granum. A whole bunch of those stacks are known as grana. Grana, that granum stack, consists of what's known as a thylakoid membrane. And these contain photosystems. So it's kind of weird. So just think of it like we are just breaking these things down. So a granum is one individual stack inside of the chloroplast. What makes up a granum is thylakoid membranes, and those are additional stacks. They almost look like cookies going up and down a ladder chain. And again, I will draw this in class because it doesn't sound like that's a clear picture description. But anyway, thylakoid membranes. Inside of those thylakoid membranes, they contain what's known as photosystems. In photosystems, there are two of them that take place in photosynthesis. You need both, and photosystems are responsible for taking in light energy. So please write that down. Photosystems responsible for taking in light energy. Photosystems responsible for taking in light energy. And these contain chlorophyll. And remember, we've talked about chlorophyll. It's a green pigment specific to plants only, and in some sort of algae, or in algae and other types of bacteria, but mostly we're going to talk about plants. And like I said, this chlorophyll or this thylakoid membrane, they contain photosystems and they take in that sun energy. And the light reaction occurs here. It makes sense that the photosystems that take in light energy coincide with the light reaction. Makes sense because light reaction, you need light, so photosystems take in light. The second part of the chloroplast is known as the stroma, and this is outside of that thylakoid membrane. So remember, we have the granum, each stacked with a thylakoid membrane. Outside of that is what's known as the stroma. And this is where the Calvin cycle takes place, or the dark reaction. Light is not absorbed in this cycle, so that is why sometimes it's called the dark reaction. And Calvin cycle is just named based off of the person who discovered this cycle. So now that you have an idea of where photosynthesis actually takes place, remember it's within the chloroplast, we are now going to discuss the stages that occur. So there's a lot of steps here. We are going to take these slowly, but again, I'm briefly describing each step in this video. In class, we will add a lot more details to our count, if you will. So we are creating ATP and NADPH and oxygen for this first stage. Those are the three things that come out of the first stage. So I have broken down the first step into step 1A and step 1B. In your reading, it reads as step 1 and step 2, but I think because they occur at the same time, I didn't really think one was more important than the other. So step 1A, and this is where sunlight strikes your chlorophyll. We absorb our chlorophyll. We absorb this, or excuse me, not our chlorophyll. We absorb the sun through chlorophyll. Energy is absorbed, and this creates what's known as excited electrons. And I don't expect you to know any more than excited electrons. There are other terms in your reading that you can look at, but in regards to when we're talking about, you just know them as excited electrons. And this occurs in photosystem 2. Remember, there are two photosystems. And so the first photosystem, known as photosystem 2, is actually discovered after photosystem 1, so that's why it's named photosystem 2. But 2 comes before 1 when we talk about photosynthesis. So anyway, excited electrons in photosystem 2. At the same time, so step 1B, enzymes in the thylakoid membrane use light energy to split apart water. So right now, what you have going on is light being absorbed, you create two excited electrons, and you have enzymes, also known as proteins, that are breaking down or splitting apart water. After step 1, you have produced 2 electrons, 1 oxygen, and 2 hydrogen. So remember, you're breaking apart water. Another thing you should know about those 2 hydrogen is that they are positively charged and they are released inside the membrane in the thylakoid interior space. And that will come into play in a little bit. Step 3, the 2 excited electrons from step 1 contain a great deal of energy, right? They just came from the sun. They're super, super charged. So kind of like the idea of hot potato. You can't just hold on to them. Like a hot potato is pretty hot, so you're going to keep bouncing it forward. So that's the same idea of what the electrons are doing. So they're bouncing around in what's known as an electron transport chain. So they are carried by a series of electron transport molecules, and all of these molecules make up an electron transport chain, an ETC. And that's usually what I'll abbreviate it as. But again, they're carried around. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I was trying to move this slide up. Let me erase that real quick. Okay, sorry, I had to move that up so I could see it a little better. But so step 3, 2 electrons reach photosystem 1. They are no longer excited because they have moved along this electron transport chain in step 2. They have moved on, and whenever any molecule is moving through things, it loses just a little bit of energy to heat. We learned that in the last video. So every source of energy, as it progresses through an organism or through any kind of process, is going to lose a little bit of that energy to heat. And so that's the same thing that's going on with these 2 electrons. As they move down this electron transport chain, they're passing energy, and it's captured to pump more H pluses into the thylakoid space. So it's not completely lost, it's just being used in a different way. So when these 2 electrons, so they're going on this train, right? They went from photosystem 2, they were captured there. They have now moved along the train, and they are at photosystem 1. Okay, so there are 2 photosystems you should know about. When these 2 electrons reach photosystem 1, they are no longer excited. Hot potato. At some point, it's not going to be hot anymore. So what they do is they get more energy from light and re-energize, and then they pass down another electron transfer chain. So both photosystems are, again, getting light energy. So photosystem 2 is where we start. These 2 excited electrons go down this electron transport chain. When they reach photosystem 1, they no longer have energy. So they need more energy, and they get that from light. Step 4, your enzymes, so type of protein, transfer the newly re-energized electrons. And remember that H plus that was created just based off the breakdown of water to a compound called NADP plus. And so what this compound is just another energy carrying molecule. And so these H pluses and these electrons are then transferred to this compound. You now produce what's known as NADPH. So we're taking those hydrogens and you're just adding them to that NADP. Step 5. Because of the fact that we have split so much water, we now have a high concentration of hydrogens. So some were used to attach to NADPH, but we still have a huge amount or a large concentration of H plus. And so this creates what's known as a chemoosmotic gradient. Because we have a large concentration, remember when we talked about osmosis and diffusion, you always, if you have a large concentration somewhere, we want to balance out. So you go from a high to a low concentration. And so we've created this gradient that the H pluses can now flow through. This allows hydrogen to flow out to a lower concentration. ATP synthase, which is a special channel protein, moves those hydrogen ions across. So they're going from the inside of the thylakoid outside to the stroma. Okay, so right now, remember, light reaction all occurs within the thylakoid where the chlorophyll is at. And it goes outside of to the stroma. Stroma, remember, that's where the Calvin cycle occurs. I know that this is a lot of information to take in right now, so please, if you feel overwhelmed, it is okay. I'm just taking a brief minute so that you can kind of keep up and catch up, because I am talking about this very fast, but I also know this process very well. Okay, so back to ATP synthase, which is the channel protein. All this is doing is allowing hydrogen to flow out to a lower concentration towards the stroma. All right, so now that all those hydrogens have moved across through that channel protein, we have ATP synthase, which we don't ever waste a protein. We're going to use it to its full capability. ATP synthase also uses energy to add phosphate to ADP. So ADP is before ATP. It's known as adenosine diphosphate, which means 2 phosphates. Now we are creating ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So we have created ATP. We have 3 phosphates on this adenosine triphosphate. So that is the one product. Remember, at the end of this stage, we have created NADPH, ATP, and oxygen as a byproduct. ATP and NADPH will move on to the next stage, which is known as the Calvin cycle, and it will begin to make glucose. And that's what we're going to learn next. Stage 2, also known as the Calvin cycle. So again, there are quite a bit of steps here, so take a minute, pause the video if you need some time to just think about all of this. Another thing you should know is that at the end of stage 1, not only are you making NADPH and ATP, but you're changing light energy to chemical energy. Okay, so that's an important fact there. There aren't as many steps in the Calvin cycle than there are the light reaction cycle, so I think you will be just fine with this one. 3 basic steps, what's known as carbon fixation, reduction, and regeneration. So those are the basic steps. So carbon fixation, what's going on is that carbon dioxide that was present combines with what's known as RUBP. And this is just a special molecule. It's a 5-carbon compound. So it has 5 carbons associated with it. And so these two things combine. And this reaction can only occur thanks to an enzyme called Rubisco. And it's given that name because it helps RUBP. So Rubisco helps combine carbon dioxide and RUBP. And this produces what's known as 3PG, a 3-carbon compound, 3-phosphoglyceric acid. And that's the name for it, phosphoglyceric acid. But it's also known as 3PG. So again, carbon dioxide and RUBP combine thanks to Rubisco, and they create what's known as 3PG. Step 2, reduction. Molecules of 3PG that were made from step 1 gain energy from ATP and NADPH from the light reaction. Remember, we created those in the light reaction. So we're going to use that energy in some way. We're not just going to make something, use some energy to not use that energy. It's kind of a waste of energy. There's a lot of energies there. Just ignore that. But anyway, so your molecules of 3PG gain energy and then rearrange themselves to form G3P. There's a lot of letters here, and I know you're probably really annoyed right now, but that's okay, you'll live. But the reason why they rearrange is because of the fact that G3P, the new molecule that's formed, has a little more energy than 3PG, and you need that little more energy to go on to create glucose. So the G3P that was created thanks to that rearrangement goes on to create glucose, and some of it also stays behind to move on to step 3. So there are 2 ways that these G3Ps can go. Some will go on to make glucose, and then others will go on to step 3, which is known as regeneration. The remaining G3P molecules use energy from ATP to form RUBP. So again, we are using every source of energy that we have, and remember, RUBP is in the first step, that 5-carbon molecule that I talked about that starts the Calvin cycle, and this allows that cycle to continuously repeat and repeat and repeat. So this is a cycle and that it goes on and on and on. The light reactions are a series of reactions that occur based off an excited electron. So a little bit of differences there. And finally, we are going to talk about one last thing before we end this video. It's known as chemosynthesis. And so not all organisms use light energy depending on where they live. If they live in really, really dark caves or in areas where light does not, or where there's not a lot of light present, they use what's known as chemical energy. So organisms using chemical energy instead of light energy, this is known as chemosynthesis. And so many of these organisms who undergo this process live in very unusual places, like in deep caves, underwater, and really, really, really deep areas where you don't see the sun. And that is all I have for you. If you have any questions, we will talk about everything in class. Don't worry if you're freaking out. I highly suggest the crash course on photosynthesis. It is a lot more detailed than I went into, and it even gives you like the numbers that you have after every stage. Don't freak out. We will talk about everything in class. If you have any questions, please ask me on Edpuzzle.